Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Well, hey, Jim, and thank you, everybody listening today. So whenever popular books are made into movies or TV series, it's likely, or it happens often, that a lot of chatter ensues, right? Those who read the book are often loyal to the author's take, or even just to a particular vision of the characters or the setting that you might have imagined while you were reading it. Etsy sells shirts that say the book was better for a reason, right? But then there are those on the other side who really appreciate the story and the casting as decided on by the filmmaker. So it's not surprising that when Colleen Hoover's best-selling book, It Ends With Us, was recently made into a movie, some discussion was going to ensue. However, it's not your average banter, because It Ends With Us is making headlines because of what some are claiming that the book and the movie leave out about the seriousness of domestic violence. So just to give you some quick context, Hoover's book centers on a woman who finds herself in an abusive relationship with her husband. And it begins, though, like a classic romance novel. It shifts, however, to take a very serious look at domestic violence. Both the book and the movie, however, have come under fire for romanticizing the abuser or downplaying some red flags that, in reality, could lead to the difference between life or death for the one being abused. Jim, why is this striking such a chord for people, and for whom specifically?
Well, I think the most obvious reason is because so many women have been or are being physically abused. That's why it's an issue. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, more than 10 million women a year are physically abused by their partner. 10 million a year, United States alone. That's 20 people a minute. 20 people a minute. And sometimes when you hear stats, you can just get numb to it. And think about that. The vast majority, obviously, are women who are abused by their husband or boyfriend. To have an idea of how widespread this is, studies show that 1 out of every 3 women right now, one out of every 3 of all women have been subject to some form of physical violence by a partner at least once in their lifetime. There are 20,000 calls to domestic violence hotlines every day. This is just the United States. So it struck a chord because sadly so many women have been struck. I'm not trying to be glib about it, but that's why. But that's not the only reason a film about domestic violence is making waves. You brought up another one that is very being talked about. The movie is facing criticism for appearing to glamorize the depiction of domestic abuse. If you've read the book or you've seen the movie, or maybe you've done both, you know that the film, which pulls from Hoover's own experience watching her parents who were abusive toward each other, it tells the story of a florist named Lily Rose, played in the movie by Blake Lively, who falls in love with a neurosurgeon named Ryle Kincaid, played by Justin Baldoni. As they begin to date and as the relationship begins to develop, he transitions from being charming and charismatic to being physically and emotionally abusive. By the way, a really good summary of the plot and some of the concerns being raised by people can be found in an NPR article that we'll link to in the show notes if you want a good overview. There's a lot out there, but that one was particularly concise and helpful. Bloom eventually ends the relationship, telling her daughter that the cycle of violence ends with us, hence the name of the film. It ends with us. But many have noted, though, that the promotion of the film leaves that whole angle out. In other words, that they don't want to portray this as a film about domestic violence. They're trying to avoid that like the plague. Even the interviews by Blake Lively promoting the film have come under fire for not even speaking to the issue, not even letting you know that domestic violence is even a part of the film, when it's the heart of the film. And was certainly the heart of the book, almost, giggling her way through the interview as if it really is just some kind of Meg Ryan, Tom Hanks romantic flick. In one promotional video, Lively sits next to the novel's author, as you mentioned, Colleen Hoover, and encourages the audience to grab your friends, wear your florals, and head out to see it. Florals a reference to the fact that her character ran a flower shop. It's just being put forward as your typical girls' night out, romance movie. But the subject of the film is obviously much darker, and as is the book. It's a film about domestic abuse. And in the film, she's pushed down a flight of stairs. There's an attempted rape. I mean, it's horrific stuff. As one activist and domestic violence survivor put it, and let me see if I can quote her because I brought this. She said, "When we use trauma as entertainment, it can feel really exploitative and just irresponsible, and in many ways tone deaf to the actual issue." Ironically, Baldoni, who was the actor portraying the offender, who was also the director of the film, he had a dual role, has been seen as the only one pointing out the message of the film and people really can end this cycle of violence. But again, he was seen as an outlier with all those attached to this particular movie. The bulk of the reaction has been, again, this phrase keeps coming off, that it's just tone deaf to the abuse involved with the film. And again, how it could be seen as glamorizing and domestic violence in general, that the movie framed as a love story could be sending the signal. I mean, this is what's really insidious. And I think what probably is what people maybe not be saying, but I think what they're feeling viscerally is that you're framing this as a love story, a romantic movie to go be seen in the context of a romantic movie that has domestic violence weaved throughout it, which could lead one to signal that violence is to be accepted within the context of romance. It's kind of a really subtle kind of message that, this is just kind of a part of what a nice romantic relationship movie could be, violence. It normalizes it and it desensitizes people to it.
Well, in full disclosure, I haven't watched the movie. I have read the book, though. And as you mentioned, at the end of the book, Colleen Hoover does include in a note from the author that an explanation that, that the book was partly influenced by an abusive marriage that her mother was in. However, she does go on to say that by no means does she intend for the characters of her book to define domestic abuse, nor to define the characteristics of most abusers. And to quote her, she says, "Every situation is different. Every outcome is different." Can you talk a bit maybe about the different faces of domestic violence?
Well, there's so many that I have sadly encountered over the years just as a pastor, but let me get to that. Let's begin with the faces that are in the book, the faces that are actually, in the movie. The main character, Lily, came from an abusive family. Her father was abusive. When you come from an abusive home, you have an acceptance of it, sadly, sometimes as normal. You can even repeat the violence yourself. That which scarred you, you end up doing the same and scarring others. That's why so much is made about breaking cycles, ending generational patterns of sin, because it can be repeated. Another dynamic that the movie fleshes out is really about Lily herself, how she responds to Ryle's behavior. Like a lot of confident women, and she's portrayed as a very confident woman, she persuades herself she can fix him, and never imagining how bad the abuse would eventually get. There's just this struggle to see themselves as victims, as opposed to this is something I've got to fix or overcome. Well, leaving the film and the faces of domestic violence put forward there, in my experience, I've seen women justify their husband's behavior as if they were the ones who made it happen. They provoked it. They deserved it in some sense. Or the violence is flowing both ways, where both partners are being physically violent toward each other. They literally just are fistfights each other. I've seen women who just accept it as part of marriage. It's just what you do, and this is how I've often seen it played out. They'll say, he's just so nice and so loving and so sweet and so kind and so providing and so good with the kids and committed as a father, until he isn't. As in changing when he starts to drink, or when he's under stress, or maybe he's great with the kids, great provider, but he can turn with anger on his wife. But then he's apologetic about it. And so, he just apologizes and he's all tears and I love you and I'm so sorry, it'll never happen again. And she accepts it and moves on. And then, of course, he does it again and again. I've seen perhaps most of all also a sense of shame, a sense that it has to be kept in the closet, which just adds to this sense of, the face of domestic abuse that says I've got to bear this burden alone. And there's a shame, like a stigma attached to it. I think most of the times when I've seen it surface in a way where someone really gets honest, reaches out for help, realizes this has to end, finally waves her hand and says, I've been a victim all these years, is when a child gets involved in the abuse and they fear for the safety of their child. So those are some of the faces from both the film of domestic violence, some of the faces from what I've encountered over the years. But if you want kind of a clinical answer about the faces of abuse, it tends to fall into 5 categories. There's obviously physical abuse. This is the most recognizable form and involves any use of physical force: hitting, shoving, biting, strangling, using weapons with the intention of causing fear or battery or injury. A second type is emotional abuse. This is often overlooked. Emotional abuse is about eroding a person's sense of self-worth and independence. That can include criticism, intimidation, humiliation, a refusal to ever be pleased. They're never pleased, they're never satisfied, never happy. Sexual abuse, which is any type of sexual behavior that is performed or attempted without consent. Financial abuse. This type of abuse is often subtle, but it's controlling money, controlling resources, stealing from or defrauding a partner, withholding access to funds. And then the final classic form of abuse is psychological abuse. This involves causing fear through intimidation, threatening physical harm to oneself, the victim, others, pets, destruction of property, isolating the victim from friends and family. There's a lot of ways where psychological abuse can take place. So, long answer, 3 different ways, but those are some of the faces of it.
Let's talk a moment about abusers, because oftentimes abusive people can appear as ideal partners. They often do at the beginning of a relationship. Colin Hoover, I would say, does capture this well, and it ends with us. She presents the male protagonist, Ryle, as extremely likable at first and nearly indistinguishable from the male protagonists of your average rom-com. What tends to characterize most abusers, though, is their need to maintain or gain power and control in a relationship. And as you mentioned, this is often a learned behavior, pointing to the tragic backgrounds of those who find themselves in the situation in the first place. Not always, but sometimes. In our society that tends to pathologize sin and evil, how can we have empathy for those who fall victim to violent learned behavior, but not stand for the abuse?
That's a tricky one.
Mm-hmm.
The best way I can think of answering it is by maybe telling a story of redemption that involves a lot of the dynamics you raised. It doesn't downplay the sin, but it does offer empathy to the person and hope for their repentance and something of an explanation of what led to it. The story that comes to mind is one I remember telling in a message that I gave on domestic violence, or as part of a series on Me Too, I believe it was actually. But in 2013, the Baltimore Ravens running back Ray Rice was, oh my gosh, if you follow football at all, back in 2013, Ray Rice of the Ravens was just on top of the world. He had just helped his team win the Super Bowl in a historic game against the San Francisco 49ers. So he was at the ultimate peak of his career and of his profession. But just 1 year later, he hit rock bottom after being caught on camera brutally knocking his fiancée unconscious in the elevator of an Atlantic City casino. He was fired by the Ravens. He has not played professional football since. 3 years after that event, though, a lot of people don't know the rest of the story. He was speaking at Liberty University, the largest Christian university in the United States, in this special extended convocation that they had. that featured, along with him, a panel of students, administrators, and counselors who were all sharing stories of domestic violence, as well as avenues of change and resources for help. Why was Rice there? Well, because he'd given his life to Christ. He confessed his abuse. He turned from it. He admitted that. Well, he realized that for him, he never really knew how to be a man. Had never been mentored into what it meant to be a man, and that was he confessed to being emotionally and financially abusive before he became physically abusive, and by taking steps into emotional financial abuse, kind of opened the door wider for eventual physical abuse. So he kind of that kind of domino effect. And he makes absolutely no excuses for his behavior whatsoever. But as I mentioned, he has since given his life to Christ, went through extensive counseling. He got help. He changed. And no one celebrates that more than his wife and children. And little footnote, that fiance that was the victim of his domestic violence ended up being, he was so changed, she married him and became his wife. And Rice now travels around the country, speaking to high school students and college athletes about domestic violence and using his own story as a cautionary tale. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think it does kind of, there. You don't excuse sin, but it gives a face of empathy and also maybe hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it leads well into the next question I had wanted to ask you, because this podcast is about church and culture, and it's naive to think that the church is immune from domestic violence, even if the church stands in direct contrast to domestic violence with a picture of marriage that God gives us. But what can be challenging for Christian women in particular is, ironically, the very nature of the God that we believe in. We believe in a God who performs miracles, who can turn hearts from stone to flesh. We know the prevalence of evil within our own hearts. We know the transformative power of forgiveness. And we also know that divorce is not God's plan A. So it's not uncommon for Christian women to stay in an abusive relationship for far too long because they don't want to give up on hoping that the power of God will heal their husbands. What counsel? I know that you've confronted this in your years of ministry. What counsel do you give women who are just fighting with that?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because there are some things that I want to say and have said to women in these situations as a pastor that I feel strongly about. And I think that in many, many times with many, many subjects in the teaching, in the message, I'll stop and say, look, I'm going to talk to you right now just as a father. I'm just going to talk to you as an older man. And whether I'm speaking to men or young women or just, where I'm going to say, look, I'm just going to talk to you as your pastor now for a minute, just kind of, we've looked at what the Bible has to say. Like, can I just talk to you for a minute about some things? So let me kind of do that. And this is what I have historically said. I've said it publicly. I've said it privately. First, I always say, look, there is absolutely nothing you have done or ever could do to justify being hurt. Period. You did not deserve it. There's nothing. I don't care what you feel you might have done to provoke it. There is nothing that would deserve your husband, your partner being violent with you. End of story. So you've done nothing. You need to understand that. Second, there's nothing about being a godly woman, about being a Christian wife, that calls you to submit to any form of violence or abuse at the hands of your husband. Absolutely nothing. Or any other man. I mean, partner, boyfriend, anything, period. If you've got that rattling around in your head, you've somehow, somewhere along the lines, been fed a big dose of spiritual malpractice, because that's just simply not true. Silence is not spiritual. Silence is not spiritual. Submitting to domestic abuse is not spiritual. It's sin against you. Third, if he won't change, if he won't get help, if he won't go to counseling, if he won't repent, if he won't turn from this, yes, I tell them you need to leave. I do. The Bible says that one of the grounds for divorce is physical abandonment, which means your spouse leaves you or acts in a way that forces you to separate. His action is forcing abandonment, whether he leaves or he's forcing you to leave. Physical abuse of you or your children is forcing you to separate. So, and for those people who aren't married, but you're dating someone who is violent or abusive and you're still in that relationship, I just, my gut reaction is to want to just walk up and just wrap my arms around you in a great big father's bear hug and just weep that you've had such a dysfunctional representation of what you deserve in a man that would lead to you accepting that in a relationship. I don't know what to say except, end that relationship before marriage, because I can tell you absolutely he is not God's man for you. I can tell you. You don't have to wrestle with that one. He's not God's man for you. It's not. Don't spend another second with him. It's not to be tolerated. It's not normal. Here's what's mind-boggling. I used to always talk about this in terms of just within the context of marriage. Just thinking that, gosh, I mean, if a man's ever going to be on his best behavior, it's going to be dating and courtship. Well, that was then. This is now. Because nearly 1.5 million high school students, I read, in the United States are physically abused by someone they're dating every year. 1.5 million high school students every year being abused by whoever they're dating. And more than a third, and this sometimes I hate stats because I get them in my head. A third of 10th graders, more than one out of every 3 have been physically or verbally abused by a dating partner. It's just insane. And I tell women, young women, you deserve better. You deserve better. You're worth more than that. End that relationship. And I know that's easier said than done, saying in that relationship, particularly if you're married. I understand.
What I appreciated about the book, and I feel like it's been generating a lot of discussion, is the advice that's often, I think, well-meaningly, but oftentimes misinformed, given to women who are in an abusive relationship, is just leave. Because it's so much more complex than that. I feel like in the book, I mean, there's the complexity that's related there, but that's so minor compared to what most women, and you add children into that situation and just how difficult the just leave is. Why is that so much easier said than done?
Well, and I'm glad, because we do need to, I want to unpack that, because like I said, I would say you need to flee for the safety of your child and for your safety. Because let's be honest, many of these domestic violence can result in death, and it tends to escalate. But anyway, regardless, when I say that, give that advice, and I'm talking to them, I understand personally, and often we'll talk with them about, now let's talk about why that's going to be so hard, and I know why it's hard, and let's talk about what needs to happen to help do something hard. When we're in a situation like this where that seems to be the best course of action. But just so that people can have empathy with these situations and don't just say, well, silly woman, why don't you just walk out on him? Nobody should subject themselves to that. Well, first, I mean, they fear leaving him. People who say you should just walk away don't know what it's like to be in their place. He may have even threatened you in very specific ways if you ever did leave him, and you're terrified he'll follow through on those threats. I mean, he hit you, maybe he'll do that too. That he'll hurt you or kill you, or he'll hurt or kill the kids, or he'll win custody of the children, and you're not there to protect them, that he'll harm or kill pets or others, or he threatens your family, or he threatens that he'll ruin you financially. I mean, the list goes on and on. Let's not. I mean, this person has already shown themselves to be a person of no morality and a brute, and so this woman's thinking there's nothing that I would put past him. Then there's the practical side of things. Where am I going to go? Where am I going to live? How am I going to support myself? It's kind of like when we counsel someone at MEC about getting married. And we just had a conversation, I think, about this as pastors recently. And, you said, well, let's talk about maybe not living together and honoring Christ before your marriage. And even if you just separate from now until the wedding day, I mean, let's talk about those kinds of issues. And same thing. Well, where would you have us go? What would you have us do? Our finances are all intertwined, or we've bought this house together. I have nowhere to move out. He has nowhere to move. I mean, life gets messy, and so many times when you get into these situations, you find yourself unscrambling eggs, which is very hard to do. And so people who are, quick to say these things don't understand how. Just tells me they're not in pastoral ministry, because they make it sound so neat and clean when it's really quite messy. But again, where's she going to go? How's she going to support herself? Most cities don't have anywhere near enough shelters for women who are victims of domestic violence. So you feel trapped. But again, though, I keep coming back. If he's unwilling to get the help he needs, if he's unwilling to change, unwilling to stop, you have to get out for the safety of you and your children. I mean, this is physical violence. And do all you can to work on that marriage, but from a vantage point of physical safety for you and your children. And if from that place of safety, he won't address this in ways that allow you to return, you have complete biblical grounds for divorce. And by the way, one of the things I've found is a lot of women feel like, I'm not getting anywhere, but they find that when they do actually leave, there's a wake-up call on his end. And others often in the church become involved with it, and it becomes something much more, we start to make some progress oftentimes. Now, I'm not rooting for divorce or anything like that, but I need to tell you that, again, I tell people, you're not called to a marriage where violence against you or your child is happening. That isn't marriage. But having said that, it also speaks to how the church as a community of believers really needs to stand up and serve her at her point of need. And let me be very specific. The community of men in the church must protect her and reach out and work for her husband's repentance. The community of believers in the church must rally around her and provide housing and care in their homes. It's like so many other issues of our day. It's easy to denounce something as wrong and tell people not to do it, but then you don't ever bother to serve them as they attempt to do just that, to follow what you've told them they should do to be faithful. So, for example, people who say, you shouldn't get an abortion, at any time, including first trimester. Well, if that's your view, you need to stand with those people who unexpectedly and unwantingly get pregnant and decide to carry that child full term. Most of them are statistically going to be young. They're going to be single parent moms. They will not have personal support. They're not going to have much in the way of money or resources. There's going to be a season of time in that pregnancy they're not going to be able to perhaps work, certainly right afterward. If you believe they shouldn't have gotten an abortion, be there for them when they don't. It's the same for women who are victims of domestic violence. If you tell them that that's a sin against them, that they need to flee that, to escape that, to seek safety, be there for them to help them do just that.
Well, yeah, because as you mentioned at the top of the podcast, I mean, domestic violence is just so prevalent. You said more than 1 in 3 women have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And again, the shock value should never go away when we say an intimate partner, that's who they're experiencing this from.
I'm glad you raised stalking, by the way, because that was something we haven't talked about. And that's a form of psychological abuse, without a doubt.
Yeah. So
and these days, stalking doesn't mean you're following them down the street. It's what you're able to do online. It's what you're able to do through. It's really just it's a new day.
Yeah, social media for sure. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. So, I mean, you just walked through, because I was going to ask you, with it being so prevalent, And there's so many personal experience of this. And again, as you already mentioned, there's so many different faces of it. It just doesn't all look the same. I was going to ask you, like, how can the church better prepare itself to walk alongside those who suffered from domestic violence, or also for those who perpetuate it, for the abusers? You already mentioned a handful of things of us being willing and ready to walk alongside women. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Well, beyond what I've already mentioned, there are several things that churches can do. First, teach on this. And this is a word to pastors and church leaders. Teach on this. When was the last time your church taught on domestic violence, brought up domestic violence, or brought it up in a series on marriage? I don't know how, I personally, speaking for me, I don't know how you can cast the vision for marriage and family and the role of a husband to protect, provide, and cherish, and not talk about how we can get twisted and distorted and address the elephant in the room, which is the men who are not protecting, but are using their strength and power to inflict pain and harm. It's a natural way to pivot and talk about something that's absolutely crucial. Men need to know what it means to be a man, and let's be clear. Most men, what does it mean to be a man? They think about what their dad passed on to them, how to change a tire, fix transmission, I don't know, tools and tips and techniques and things like that. And that's all good. But the heart of being a man has to do with character. The heart of being a man has to do with attitudes and understanding roles and responsibilities toward women and family and children and church, God, vocation. And this is not being taught. It is not being taught. It is not being passed on. So men need to know what it means to be a man, how to treat those who are weaker than him, whether it's a wife or a child. And when you teach on it, not only do you address the issue and help men think about it and start to become discipled in that, but this is what's so crucial. You make it legal for women to surface with it without shame. They know they're not going to be blamed. They're not going to be condemned. And that's so important. One of the things that I've found, and it seems like you and I might have had a coffee about this once. I don't remember. We talk a lot offline. But I think I think I have taught to you and other pastors and teachers here that when you talk about something, here's the power of teaching. One of many things that's powerful about teaching. But you make it legal to talk about. You surface it, and whether you have a conversation about clinical depression and how that's it's okay to treat that and address that. It's okay, it's not a sin to say I'm dealing with depression. All of a sudden, you make it legal for people to surface with clinical depression. And what's appropriate and how to deal with that both spiritually and medically and if you talk about spouse abuse, you make it legal to talk about that. There's 1,000 things that when you teach on it in a caring, compassionate, and biblical way, you and in a way that's non-condemnatory and strips judgmentalism out of it and just surfaces up as the issue that so many struggle with. Same with pornography, same with whatever. You make it legal to talk about. And all of a sudden you have men talking to men about these things and women talking to women and people talking to their pastors. And, that's just so powerful. The second thing a church can do is have seminars on domestic violence. And I would say, I would add a footnote, have seminars on domestic violence, but that are offered in a way that they can be accessed discreetly. Like an online seminar or an on-demand seminar. I think that's important. There's some of the touchiest subjects need to be offered in a way that people can access that content privately and discreetly. And so, this is something I don't know that you and I've ever talked about. This would be good for us to review too. But when we offer certain institute classes or seminars, it's very common for us to require registration and information and such. I would say that on particularly sensitive subjects, we might want to just tear all that down and just say, I can watch this, view this, attend this with complete anonymity. And I think on touchy issues like domestic violence or maybe addiction to pornography or many other issues, that would probably be wise. But seminars that help women know what to do, how to do it, how to break free, how to understand it, things of that nature. A third thing I think that can happen is to create a culture where people in your community will be more than willing to shelter someone in need. Talk openly about how that's going to be a wonderful ministry in our church. Foster care is growing as a concern in many churches right now, and well, it should. Victims of domestic violence are in a very similar need. I don't know if you ever thought about what happens with foster kids and people in domestic violence. They both often have a very sudden, unexpected, immediate emergency need to find a place to go to. Very little notice until things can be sorted out one way or another on the home front. So really, in that sense, you can put foster kids and victims of domestic violence in the same boat. And a lot of churches are very sensitized toward, okay, we're going to have a group of people that were trained and their ministries be ready to receive foster kids. What about a group ready to receive battered women? And then finally, just another thought that came to mind: churches should get behind shelters designed for victims of domestic abuse. Giving of their money, their volunteers, their prayers. We look for this and continue to look for new opportunities to do just that. In fact, recently, a group of us visited a newer shelter here in town in view of vetting it as a potential missions partner. We hit a couple of roadblocks with that one, but we're looking now at others, and we're constantly looking for opportunities just like that because we want to get behind it, put our collective effort, money, will, and resources where our mouth is. And we have a philosophy with our Missions 2.0 efforts and our partners is that if we feel we need to outsource something, refer people to something, like a food pantry, housing shelter, place for battered women. If we're going to refer you or refer people to that, we'd better be supporting that group that we're referring you to financially and with our volunteers. So we take that very, very seriously. But the bottom line, Alexis, is that I would just say to churches, please, this cannot be met with silence anymore. It can't be met with silence. Nobody, very, very few churches are talking about this, and very few churches. And that's just so wrong. It has to be talked about.
Well, I'm thankful that we had the chance to talk about it today then. And as I was praying over this episode before, I hope it was helpful, whether something that you said right now, Jim, or something that maybe that we feature in the show notes as a helpful resource. Because statistically, I have no doubt that there are going to be people who are listening to this who either have found themselves in a violent situation in the past or maybe do right now. And so I do pray that the words that you spoke today, Jim, will go down in just the right places, and that someone will feel more encouraged to get help after this, and just have a few more resources up their sleeves, or that churches would have more resources up their sleeves to be able to care for those who are. So thank you for being able to broach this subject, and thank you all for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next week.